People versus Ramos is a pretty outrageous case. The very first sentence of the opinion reads, Rafael Ramos was charged with making criminal threats against Nancy Garcia, and he chose to represent himself at trial. Always a bad idea to represent yourself, and especially in a criminal case. And I'll tell you why. The facts of this case are rather simple and not really important, because after all, the most important thing that comes out of this case is what happens during trial, but I'll tell you anyways. Rafael Ramos comes up to a house belonging to his girlfriend. The girlfriend later testifies that they've been broken up and they're no longer a couple, but he's drunk, he sits on the porch, and eventually he's trying to get inside the house. He breaks the screen, puts his hand through, and tries to get in. Nancy Garcia, who's a neighbor across the street, tries to intervene. Now, she knows that he's drunk, she's seen him before and thinks that he's a gang member, and she's basically met with Rafael Ramos yelling at her that she should mind her own business and that he will fuck her up. That's essentially what happens in this case. And then he's charged with making criminal threats against Nancy Garcia. Here's what happens in this case. Rafael Ramos asks the court to appoint a new attorney for him roughly 3 times. Each one of those requests gets denied, so he doesn't get a new attorney. On the day of trial, he comes in and the prosecutor brings in phone calls, jail calls that he has made to his girlfriend while he's been waiting for trial, while he's been in custody waiting for trial. Here's a side note. If you have a loved one who is in custody, remember that all the phone calls and all the jail visits are recorded. So the prosecutor can use that against you once the time comes for trial. You're not being protected. There's no confidentiality in jail except when you talk to your own attorney. So during trial, on the first day, the prosecutor brings in the calls. The attorney says that he needs more time to review these calls. At this point, Mr. Ramos says that he doesn't want to continue. He wants to proceed with trial. He refuses a continuance, so he says he's going to go on that day. Then he fires his attorney that day and says that he'd rather go on his own without his attorney. And then the judge warns him that he needs to be ready, and there's going to be no continuances even if he chooses to represent himself. And that's what he chooses to do. And that turns out to be a mistake. Next morning, Rafael Ramos does not show up to court. He tells the medical professionals at his jail facility that his stomach hurts and that he can't go to court. After being checked out, turns out he's fine, so he gets sent to court. The judge warns Rafael Ramos that if he continues to deliberately influencing the jury by gaining sympathy from them, that he might get kicked out or penalized some other way for his conduct. So the trial starts, the jury gets seated down, the prosecution opens the case. During this opening, Rafael Ramos decides to say that he needs to say something important to the court. The judge says there's going to be time and that he needs to be quiet and let the prosecution do the opening statement. Then Rafael Ramos stands up and starts yelling that he needs an attorney, he's not ready, he doesn't think this is fair, he thinks he's not getting a fair trial. So the judge stops the proceedings, moves the jury out of the room at first, out of the courtroom, and then he kicks out the defendant from trial. Now here's the crazy part. Then the trial continues without Rafael Ramos. The prosecution is allowed to do an opening statement and do a direct examination of Nancy Garcia, who is the victim in the crime. This is all happening while the defendant is not in court. And his attorney is not in court because he doesn't have one. He's representing himself. Rafael Ramos is then allowed to return back to the courtroom. And then he proceeds to cross-examine the witness, but he really can't because he never heard the direct examination. Then the case goes on with him, but he missed half of the show. So now it goes to the jury, and without any surprises, the jury convicts him on all 3 counts. Mr. Ramos appeals. He says that when he was involuntarily booted out of court, that was a violation of his 6th Amendment. Now you're thinking, what's the 6th Amendment? And I'll tell you. 6th Amendment protects you in a number of ways. One, the most obvious. This is the case about attorneys. So yes, it does give you a right to have an assistance of counsel. It also gives you a right for impartial jury. It gives you a right to cross-examine witnesses. It gives you a right to compel witnesses to show up to court, and so on. So you might be already guessing how this ends. The appellate court says that when you kick out a defendant, you really put a hurdle in front of the defense attorney because your client can tell you additional information during trial. And if he's not in court, he can't do that. But when you kick out a defendant who also represents himself, you've really kicked out both the defendant and the attorney. Because at that moment, there's no one there to represent the client. He's gone, he's out of the court. So yes, that is a violation of the 6th Amendment. Now, the Attorney General tries to make a number of legal arguments. One of them is that in this case, he says Mr. Ramos was not involuntarily kicked out. By being disruptive, he chose to leave. And the court doesn't buy that. The court says that in fact, Mr. Ramos was kicked out and he didn't choose to leave. Yes, he was disruptive, but the court kicked him out. He didn't leave himself. And let me tell you what it means in a non-legal way. That means the case is remanded and gets pushed back to the lower court, where Mr. Ramos gets a new trial. And hopefully this one goes better for him. Or at least he's there to participate. Of course, we'll hope that he's not disruptive again. If you enjoyed this video, please click like, subscribe, hit that bell button so next time you can tell that I posted a new video, and thanks for watching.